Okay.
Hello, everyone.
I'm Jordan.
I'm Crystal.
Gosh.
We're also twinsies, if you didn't notice.
Yeah, our shirts are also matching.
Yeah, that's right.
We read the book The Selfish Gene by Richard Dawkins. We just want to give you a brief rundown of it. The main idea of the book.
The main summary for the book, it's really complicated. There's a lot packed in there.
Yes, there is.
It's in chapters of creativity. This guy is smart.
Yeah, he also writes way too much.
Yeah, it was kind of frustrating to actually read. He's just so locked in to how suggestions of how natural selection could have happened. Like, it's the only way that it could have happened is through his view.
Mm-hmm. The whole point of what he's trying to say is that that it's not groups or individuals that look out for themselves.
It's a gene.
That's sort of the whole idea of the title, The Selfish Gene, comes into play, because he's arguing throughout the whole thing that our individual genes are the ones that are controlling us and making us do what we do.
Even our behaviors.
Yeah. And that every living thing that we see is just a survival machine that the gene manipulates.
The gene also can manipulate altruism and selfish behavior. Basic definition for altruism is that altruism is basically giving yourself up for the benefit of the species in some way, making a sacrifice in some way for the benefit of a species or the gene or Yeah. An example of altruism would be bees stinging, because they sacrifice themselves. Like, when they sting something, their organs can come out with it.
Selfishness is just the other side of that, like acting solely for self-interest.
An example of selfishness would be penguins pushing each other off to the hole where they're thinking about going in and getting food for themselves, but they're not sure if there's a seal waiting for them underneath the water that they can't see, so they push each other off in the hole. Like, no, dude, you go in first.
So yeah, and he does that constantly throughout the book. He's
gives a lot of examples.
Always giving examples about certain animals that where altruism is true, but then explaining that it's actually they're acting selfishly. So he kind of destroys the idea of there being like the good of the group.
Human behavior kind of goes against the natural law and way of things. So we're just going to run through the book, little brief summaries on each chapter, the main points that we got out of it. In the first chapter, the main question that Dawkins is trying to address is, why are genes selfish? And explaining that in a broad view and narrowing down to the smallest unit of a gene.
So basically, Dawkins is trying to give evidence and set up his entire argument for why he believes genes are selfish. So he starts in chapter 1 just setting up a super broad stage, defining selfishness and altruism, giving examples of that, like we talked about in the introduction. So stinging bees, penguins. He also touched on how sometimes species will foster a special unlimited form of altruism in the individual, but it's ultimately for selfish ends.
Selfish ends of fitness.
Right.
So that they continue the species.
Right. So the whole idea, and he talks about that in the first chapter, the whole idea is for the individual, the genes, to make their genes go as far as possible. And they're using survival machines, which are humans, animals, plants, to do that.
He turns his attention in chapter 2 to the idea of replicators, how genes first got started, the process of that. And I mean, there's multiple experiments kind of simulating young Earth conditions and seeing how that would form the basic units. Like amino acids, how they would have to come up with a way to carry the property of replicate.
Yeah, the name of the chapter is The Replicators, and Darwin and Dawkins, I combined the two. Dawkins is basically talking about how he believes life got started, so the origin of life. And it's really kind of interesting and sad, so we'll probably discuss that in class, because it's kind of crazy to see how he starts with this primeval soup that he talks about, and then out of that, this replicator molecule appeared that had the ability to replicate itself.
Individual molecules in the primeval soup either 1. Last a long time, 2. Replicated rapidly, or 3. Replicated accurately or had a copying fidelity. So that are like the 3 characteristics of stability and or what moves it forward to natural selection.
It's basically his theory of how he thinks that DNA and genes even started, and it's a little ludicrous when you read it, so we'll talk about that a little bit more in class. But he kind of ends the chapter saying, genes are in you and me. They created us, body and mind, and their preservation is the ultimate rationale for our existence. They have come a long way, those replicators. Now they go by the name of genes, and we are their survival machines.
We are survival machines.
Yes. Yes, we are. So that's kind of, and he starts, like, that's at the beginning of the book. So the whole rest of the book is based on that perspective that we are only a means to an end, that our genes are actually the ones controlling and manipulating everything around us. So that's chapter 2.
Hey guys, so chapter 3 kind of goes over the basics of protein synthesis and DNA replication. He gives the analogy of books, volumes, pages to kind of help explain all that. And the central argument of this chapter would be one gene can be regarded as a unit that survives through a large number of successive individual bodies. A gene is defined as any portion of chromosomal material that potentially lasts for enough generations to serve as a unit of natural selection. Dawkins determines that the unit of natural selection, rather than being the population or the individual, is the gene, the fundamental unit of self-interest. But by defining it that way, he is making himself immediately right in the way that he's explaining it. So Dawkins also defines natural selection as the differential survival of entities.
And we just wanted to give you guys those definitions so that you could know that that's what Dawkins was talking about in his arguments. So regardless of definitions that we've heard about genes or natural selection, we wanted to give you guys those because that's the way Dawkins is using them in his whole argument, and that kind of sets the stage for that. So we talked about this a little bit earlier, but just touching on it again. Dawkins really goes hard for the idea that genes last forever and that their copies are perpetuated throughout time, despite the death of the organism that they are inhabiting. So they're immortal because they're able to cross over, so just continual shuffling and rearranging, and they're also basically reproducing infinitely. And then that coupled with the idea that individuals are mortal, so all plants, animals, humans, like we all die. So those 3 things are what he's arguing are making genes immortal, continuing on forever. Also in discussing just how genes work together and kind of giving us an idea of how they function and relate to each other, he uses an analogy of oarsmen in boat races. So that was helpful. But basically, there's 8 oarsmen in a boat race, and they all have to work together to be the fastest. So the oarsmen are the individual genes, and they have to work together to outrace, quote unquote, other alleles that want their particular spot on the chromosome. So as a result, genes that aren't necessarily linked to each other physically can be selected for their mutual compatibility. So all that means is 2 different genes can increase their chances of being inherited if they're able to work together. So an example of that is a gene for sharp teeth, for grinding up meat really well, would work best with a gene that codes for intestines that can actually break down that meat, as opposed to genes that code for intestines that break down plants. So a gene's environment is the other genes that surround it, and how well it works with those genes has a really big influence on how it or how it's inherited, if it's inherited. That's the idea he's trying to drive home in this chapter.
So chapter 4, the gene machine. Well, in this chapter, Dawkins uses complex metaphors to explain how genes significantly influence behavior. It's like programming a computer to play chess. Genes don't have active control of us because of the time lag problems. But genes can only program their survival machines, brains, so much for survival. They can only predict so much. Genes are supposed to build in things that will help their survival machines. The capacity to learning strategies, because every individual has a different experience in life, never knowing what might happen. They also give an ability to make gambles that pay off and the ability to imaginatively simulate situations.
So that Dawkins talked about those three things that Crystal just mentioned as things that genes can do, that genes can program into the brains of their organisms to make them better survival machines. In this chapter, Dawkins was basically trying to bolster the idea that selfishness and altruism are controlled by genes. By dictating the way that survival machines and their nervous systems, he writes, are built, genes exert ultimate power over behavior. Genes are the policymakers, brains are the executives, which is it's an interesting idea, interesting way of putting it. That he gives the genes so much power and so much credit for the way that our brains are actually functioning. So the logical conclusion to this argument is that eventually our brains would become so developed that the genes would just program them with one simple instruction: do whatever you think is best to keep us, the genes, alive. So that was the main idea of that chapter. Again, just that genes are building in survival strategies into our brains, making them better and better, and that they're also programming selfishness and altruism into our brains as well as behaviors.
Chapter 5, it's all about aggression. Natural selection favors organisms that use their environments the best. Why don't animals just kill competition outright? That's another question that this chapter presents. There are subtle costs and benefits to this other than time and energy. It talks about evolutionary stable strategy. The definition of that is the point at which evolutionarily speaking, natural selection can't select for either strategy. The strategy being pre-programmed behavioral policy. What it mostly covers is the hawk and dove strategies. Hawks always fight as hard as they can, retreating only when seriously injured. And doves, on the other hand, only threaten or intimidate, never hurting anybody or getting themselves in a fight. Often, animals play a mixture of both depending on how their opponent responds, if their opponent retaliates or something like that. Other more complex strategy options are given in Chapter 5.
Alright, so the chapter goes on to further lay out this idea of evolutionary stable strategies. Interspecies hunting, for example, does not exist because it is not an evolutionary stable strategy. Dawkins also talks about the idea that there is a built-in asymmetry in fighting strategies between two different species. So, for example, an antelope and a lion. The antelope doesn't employ a hawk strategy like the lion would. That's not evolutionarily stable. Ultimately, that will destroy the antelope population. So their fighting strategies kind of coincide so that they balance and match each other out so that there's just a stability in both populations. That's what Dawkins was getting at. Dawkins also talks about the idea of what makes a good gene. So previously, before this chapter, he said that a good gene had the ability to build a good survival machine. That was the definition of a good gene. But now, after talking about evolutionary stable strategies, the definition of a good gene is it's defined more within the context of a gene pool, which becomes an evolutionarily stable set of genes. So that's the definition of a good gene. So basically, what will happen is a new gene will occasionally permeate a gene pool and will become selected for permanently. That's not the norm, but that will happen occasionally, and that will result in a new evolutionary stable strategy. And from that, Dawkins would say a little bit of evolution has occurred. So basically, it is a step from a stable position to another more stable position. It's not this wild flux. It's just stable, a little bit of change, stable again, a little bit of change. And so, therefore, based on evolutionary stable strategies, genes are judged on the basis of their performance against the background of current evolutionary stable strategies, which is the gene pool that the genes find themselves in. That's chapter 5.
We got chapter 6. It's all about genemanship.
Which is a word that Dawkins actually made up. It's not a real word.
A gene is essentially trying to get more numerous in the gene pool and making as many copies as it can out there in the world. Genes recognize their copies in other individuals or close relatives. We are interested in explaining the success of genes specifically as a result of their altruism. Dawkins discusses mathematical calculations for relatedness in individuals.
Yeah, so it's pretty interesting because we actually, talking about the mathematical calculations, we went over a few of these things in class, especially specifically when we talked about evolutionary stable strategies. But he takes an entire chapter to kind of work out what that looks like and how we know how related individuals are to each other. So, for example, how related are brothers and sisters to each other? How related are you to your first cousin as opposed to your aunt or your uncle or your grandparents? So he takes the time to mathematically work all of that out. And the goal of him doing that is, in this chapter, to kind of argue that animals will act altruistically with an ultimately selfish end towards those relatives that are closest in genetically to them. They'll act altruistically toward them, but it's ultimately selfish because they're acting that way towards the members of their species that are most closely related to them in order to further their genes in those members because they're more closely related. So, for example, a gene will think to itself, oh, here is my brother. Now we share half of our genetic material is the same. But over here, I have my twin sister. So our genetic material is exactly the same. I'm going to do more to care for and protect my twin sister, whom I share exact genetic information with, rather than my brother, whom I only share half of my DNA with.
So the twin has the advantage.
Yes. And that's because the genes are altruistically, but actually selfishly acting in favor of that twin, because the genetic material is identical to the individual themselves. So they're going to act in the interest of that member of their family more so than their brother.
Twins rule.
Yeah, twins rule, basically. So basically, there was another point that he kind of made, which was interesting. There was some evidence that he gave that was kind of against the selfish gene theory. One example of this was bereaved monkey mothers stealing babies from other females. That is generally not something that is normal or evolutionarily stable, and so that's why it's not commonly seen among monkey populations.
You know why that ain't evolutionarily stable?
Why is that?
That's just plain mean.
Yes, it is mean.
Yes. Yes, it is.
But that's an example. Oh gosh. That's an example of some altruism, but it's not common because it's not evolutionarily stable. So to sum up kind of what we were saying and what Dawkins was saying in this chapter, ultimately altruism varies based on the level of relatedness that the animal perceives. So it's all based on the animal's perception, right? Or the gene's perception. But that is where the altruism comes from, and that's how it's determined based on the level of relatedness. And like we said, the twin in our example would have higher priority.
Well, you're more likely to give up and sacrifice something, according to Dawkins.
Yes.
For a twin. Someone who shares 100% of your DNA.
Mm-hmm.
In the gene pool.
Yep.
Interesting facts.
Yep.
We're now on chapter 7. It's about family planning, but gene style. So this chapter is basically about how genes decide to reproduce. Dawkins talks about the difference between bringing new individuals into the world and caring for existing individuals afterward. So there are two costly options that females particularly have to choose between. Wynne Edwards first proposed the idea of group selection.
Yeah, and so he basically, his idea about that was, he was suggesting that individual animals deliberately and altruistically reduce their birth rates for the good of the group as a whole. So Dawkins is super against the idea of group selection of any kind, but he kind of goes with Wynne Edwards' ideas because they're good, they're interesting. He kind of teases them out a little bit and refers to them throughout the chapter. So, put into simpler terms, animals have less offspring than they actually are capable of for the good of the entire group. That's to conserve resources, to prevent overpopulation, to control the size of the group, and the factors that affect how many offspring that the adults can have are territoriality. So that is the idea that to get a mate, a male needs to have breeding territory already claimed and staked out, and that's the only way a female will mate with. So there's that idea, plus dominance hierarchies, which is the status that the male holds within the rest of the population. So those two factors will play into how many offspring animals actually choose to produce. So another idea that Wynne Edwards proposed that Dawkins didn't really agree with, but just kind of put it out there for thought, was that populations will occasionally aggregate or collect themselves to count how many individuals are in their population. So, for example, that could be starlings. Those are small birds, and sometimes you'll just have swarms and swarms of them. And Wynne Edwards' idea was that they're doing that so that they can kind of get a feel for how many members there are of their population, so that they can either have more offspring or less to cut back. Dawkins also argues in this chapter that altruistic systems are inherently unstable, so basically acting solely for the good of another member of your species or for your species in and of itself, like we've talked about, is not a stable strategy. So he just reinforces that idea here. And then he also talks about how outcasts of a population, so those who either don't have breeding ground or do not have a high status in the population, instead of fighting for that breeding ground or fighting to have a better status, they will conserve their energy and they'll kind of bide their time to see if another male will give up their breeding ground because they got shot by a human or something like that. So that he just kind of proposes other strategies that these outcasts can have, and how that kind of affects the population and how each male-female pair can kind of plan to have their families.
But ultimately, Dawkins argues that Wynne Edwards was right, but for the wrong reasons.
Yeah.
Wrong ideas.
Wrong reasons.
And now we're at our last chapter that we're going to cover in this video. It is chapter 8. It's about the Battle of the Generations. That is the title of it. The question of this chapter is, and that he's trying to explain and answer, is how does the selfish gene theory play out in the family? Specifically, asking about the mother's relationship with her children. What is most beneficial for the mother in the long run? What will most benefit the offspring? The happy medium between these two competing interests is what will determine parent-offspring behavior, and Jordan will explain exactly what that means.
It's interesting because this whole time up to this point, and throughout the rest of the book, he's just been talking about each individual very selfishly, and obviously that's to be expected because of the title of the book. But it's interesting because in this chapter he presents the parents' side of it, so their evolutionary benefit So he talks about the evolutionary benefit that the parent gets from living and from feeding their offspring, and then what that looks like against the offspring's evolutionary benefit as well.
Naturally, we would be thinking it would be altruistic.
Right.
But it's a little bit of both.
Yeah, it definitely has selfishness in it too, which is interesting. Everything that he's presenting has this base of selfishness to it, which is just a twist that we don't usually think about. We don't think about the world that way. So, but to kind of start this off, Dawkins asks, how can we measure how many resources and how much effort a mother in particular puts into each of her children, just so that there's a way to quantify it and a way for us to add up that evolutionary benefit. So he defines parental investment as any investment by the parent in an individual offspring that increases the offspring's chance of surviving at the cost of the parent's ability to invest in other offspring. So ultimately, parental investment is measured in loss of life expectancy of other offspring. So it comes at a cost to the individual offspring's brothers and sisters, with whom it shares half of its genetic material. So there's that tension as well. Dawkins explores a lot of explanations in that chapter as to why offspring would be motivated to act in the ways they do, and vice versa with the parents. So, for example, evolutionarily speaking, offspring would have a certain amount that they could gain by being the loudest in a bird nest, for example, for food. However, that only goes up to a certain point, since their brothers and sisters, whom they share half their DNA with, also need food too. So he's trying to feel out in the chapter at what point is it beneficial for the offspring to be the loudest and to get the most food, but then also not at a cost of killing its brothers and sisters who have the same genes that they do and who are trying to reproduce and survive. So there's this constant tension of, yes, I'm wanting to care for my genes and have my genes continue to my offspring so that they can get passed on, but I'm also wanting the genes of my close relatives, my siblings, to propagate and continue as well. So there's that tension that Dawkins refers to continually. Ultimately, Dawkins' point at the end of the chapter is that this compromise has to occur between the parent, who's looking out for their interest, trying to make sure that they have enough strength to keep reproducing in the future, and then there's this conflict between the offspring, who's trying to get as many nutrients and as much care and attention as they can. So ultimately, this compromise has to occur. And again, that's going to peak at an evolutionarily stable point, to where different strategies that some offspring might employ will get cut out or die off because either it endangered their brothers and sisters or it brought harm to themselves. So
mutually beneficial at the highest level that it can.
Yep.
Sustainable. Stable sustainability.
Yep. So that's chapter 8. So Crystal's going to talk about what we're going to do in class.
So in class, we're going to cover the rest of the book. We're also going to take a quiz. And then the quiz will be on this video and also some stuff in the actual lecture that we're going to do on Wednesday. And then discussion question too.
Yep.
So look forward to seeing you then.
Woohoo! Come ready to talk about selfishness and genes, because that's what it is.
Remember to wear jeans.
Yeah. We should wear jeans.
Yeah, we should wear jeans. We're gonna wear jeans.
Yeah, we will wear jeans.
You better make sure we wear jeans on Wednesday. We wear jeans on Wednesday, not pink.
We're gonna be watching. Oh, yeah. Truth.
Okay, well, bye.
Bye.